Hello, welcome to another GeogPod. Mr. Knight and Mr. Hatchell will be delivering side 2 of dynamic development. So this is where we get really into the more meaty part of the particular topic. So I'm going to kick off. We're going to start looking at barriers to ending poverty. So if you remember back to the previous GeogPod, we talked about physical and human factors or causes of development or underdevelopment. Okay, so really this is what then stops a country from continuing its path, along that Rostow model. And there are 3 barriers. So just make sure you've really got a clear difference in what is a cause and what is a barrier. For our barrier, there is strictly 3 that we want to think about. What prevents our countries from moving on? And they are debt, trade, and political unrest. Very simply, for debt, obviously LIDCs have huge national debts from borrowing money from wealthy countries and organisations. And obviously the key thing about when you take out a loan is you then have interest rates. And the key thing here is that they spend a lot of their time servicing the debt, servicing the interest rate payments, rather than investing that money that they could have potentially into services and infrastructure. And like we talked about on the previous GeogPod, that ability to invest in education, healthcare, your infrastructure is what's going to really allow you to become more developed. So if a country is being held back by its debt and paying off its loans, paying off the interest, it is not going to be able to invest in those key areas that allow it to develop. Again, we also looked at trade in some ways and landlocked countries and that ability. Well, on the flip side of that, also, if a country is not necessarily part of a trading agreement and it has a negative balance of trade, okay, therefore that means that they import more than they export, okay, is going to cause them a problem. Because if they export, essentially we're thinking about them selling. If we go back to GDP, that means that they were producing more than they're buying. So it generally would suggest that they're slightly more wealthy. To develop this further, ACs have TNCs that may operate in LIDCs. And we've talked about a technical term called leakage, where these TNCs will set up in our developing countries and they will have their headquarters in an AC country. So when they do set up in these LIDCs, and yes, they help to create jobs and they maybe potentially bring infrastructure improvements along with them as part of their deals. But the actual money and profit they make will often go back to that AEC country. So the actual benefit to the host country isn't as much as it could potentially be. So it's a really good one to go back to. That term leakage is a really good thing for you to think about. On our previous calls as well in human, we also talked about the role of the government being very important. Well, obviously, if a country is unsatisfied with their government, so there might be things like riots, general political unrest, well, that's going to impact on a country's ability to progress and for a government to implement, good schemes around education, healthcare, and those sort of areas. Again, corruption. Is that going to stop the investment from other industries, whether it's a TNC or other countries around the world, in supporting a country or allowing them to join their free trade agreement? Probably so. How are we going to give them types of aid if we know that the money isn't going to go to those right people? And again, we talked about that HDI as being a way we can measure that. How effective is a country at putting its money where it needs to be to improve the quality of life there? Okay, so again, it's all about investment in those key areas of infrastructure, education, and healthcare. So what can we do then to break out of poverty? Well, to support those countries that do have those barriers, there are a range of different ways that we can do that. I'm very going to briefly mention top down and bottom up, but we are going to recap that in a bit more detail later on. So I'll go literally just very quickly. So top down is where we have large scale government led schemes, okay, and we see them as expensive. So we're going to maybe remember the bit that you did on the Kariba Dam. The bottom up essentially is small scale and it gets the local people involved. So it maybe has a potential smaller impact, but it's directly targeted. Obviously, in terms of other sort of loans you might have or aid, we have short term and long term. Often when you think of aid, you come up with your mind, oh, there's been an earthquake in Haiti or there's been a volcanic eruption. Let's send some aid, food, water. That is your short term aid. For the longer term aid, we obviously want to think about, well, how do we help a country to maybe develop its infrastructure, its education? So typically that aid will be in long-term form and in terms of projects, whether that's heavily linked to economic sort of loans, or if it is actually helping set up, through other charities or NGOs, ways to help service and provide education and healthcare. Obviously, with regards to trade, okay, fair trade can allow for fair wages, and we've talked about that before. Way back, sort of even year 9, you did your fair trade. But also when we think about working in trade blocks and those free trade agreements, that will also encourage trade within those countries. If you are part of a group, you're going to get better or lower tariffs. So you pay less money for importing and exporting goods, and it's going to give you people to trade with. So that's a really, really strong one as well. And last but not least, there is something called debt relief. Well, obviously, relief is about relieving. If you think about relief of pain, like we would take paracetamol. Well, debt relief is all about reducing that loan or removing it entirely. And Zambia we looked at as an example where this occurred in 2006. And essentially, they will cut or partly cut the amount of debt that that country has borrowed. Okay, and the reason you might do that is to lower the amount that they're paying back on the loan, but significantly on that, the rates they're paying on their interest, which allows that money to be diverted and be reinvested in development, again, whether that's infrastructure, education, health. You're sensing a theme now. And obviously, with regards to positive and negative aspects of aid, it's very simply, obviously, if we have that aid, they can invest in projects that can help to develop a country's prospects. But on the flip side, well, is it top down? If it's top down, it's coming from the government, local people are not going to have a say. They're not going to be able to find that change that they need to really improve their quality of life. Things like the Room to Read scheme we'll mention later. And obviously, some of that aid is what we call tied. So tied suggests it has conditions attached to it. So maybe, for example, in Zambia, there was some tied aid from China when China in their TNCs came in, and they wanted them to make sure that they privatized their businesses, that they went out and that other people could invest in them. They weren't necessarily what we call public businesses. And therefore, China could then buy up other businesses, increase their trade, which would benefit them. Okay, so often there are tied conditions there. So that's the left-hand side done. And I've touched on it a few times. I keep dropping in Zambia. So go on, sir. Our case study for this topic is Zambia. What can you tell me?
Sorry, you did that in exactly 6 minutes as well. Amazing.
Oh, I did say I was going to try and keep it quick.
Brilliant. Okay, so Year 11, Zambia is your main case study for this entire topic of dynamic development. And we have spent, when we did these lessons, a good 9 to 10 lessons on it. So it is a very, very big part of this topic. And it is likely that your exam questions will, the 6 marker definitely, will focus on Zambia, and it will be some sort of aspect about Zambia. Now, remember, the question won't say, in Zambia, what did you look at? It will ask you about a certain aspect of development in terms of maybe the Millennium Development Goals or TNCs or strategies, bottom up, top down, etc. So just bear that in mind as we go through this. But I'm just going to introduce you to what you looked at for Zambia. And the first thing was location and background. Where is it? What it's like? So it's a landlocked country, which means, as Sir mentioned earlier, it is surrounded by other bordering nations, as you can see in the map on screen: Namibia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Malawi, Tanzania, and so forth. It has a population of 14.5 million people, and its capital is Lusaka, which is in the south central region of Zambia. And that capital city has a population of 1.7 million. So it's in a strategic area it has negatives and positives, as Sir mentioned earlier, in the sense that it doesn't have access to a sea border. It's not bordered by the sea, so trade can be difficult, but it also has advantages in the sense that it has 8 other bordering nations it can trade with, and it has used that to its advantage. And so if we then think about where it currently stands in terms of development, its wealth per capita, so the amount of income per capita, is $3,070, and that compares to a world average of $10,858. So it is behind in terms of its levels of wealth per person. It's significantly less than other LIDCs as well. So it has for years lagged behind in terms of this wealth aspect per person. It has a high birth rate and a slower death rate, which means it has a growing population. If you think back to UK 21st century again, and if we think back to the demographic transition model, or DTM, it is definitely in that sort of stage 2 process where the death rates are falling, high birth rates are still there, but the population therefore is increasing quite dramatically. It has a long poverty history. So it has a long history, as we said before, of people in poverty and wealth not increasing very highly. And it was also under colonial rule in the British Empire. So that meant that it was held back from developing further and using its own resources. Think about the Human Development Index, the HDI, which Sir also mentioned earlier. It has a score of 0.430 on that HDI scale. Okay, so it's a very, very middling country on that scale. And if we think about that compared to the UK is 0.957 each. So the UK is much higher, obviously, than Zambia would be. And its life expectancy there is 52 years. Again, if we compare that to the UK, life expectancy in the UK is 82 years. So it's a whole 30 years more. It's a country that relies on its copper industry. So it has an abundance of copper resources in certain parts of the country, and that makes up 64% of all of its exports. So without that copper, Zambia would be in an even more perilous situation than it is. It does have something it can export around the world, specifically to places like China. And China does play a role in Zambia. And it gained independence, as I said earlier, from Britain in 1964. So it's still a relatively new independent country if you think about all world countries, but it is starting to see the benefits of it being able to export its copper, etc. So what we're going to do now is, and I'm just going to zoom out for you so you can see, we're going to move on to what influences Zambia's development. So we're looking again at SEEP here, those social, economic, political, etc. ties to what happens in Zambia. So essentially we're looking at its characteristics. So let's start with its political characteristics. And Zambia, as we mentioned, was under British control until 1964. Since 1964, it has developed into a peaceful democracy that votes every 4 or 5 years in their elections for their president, and it holds elections every few years. And that means, therefore, there has been little political unrest in Zambia since British rule was released, since it became independent. So overall, we can summarize that as being Zambia is quite a peaceful nation in terms of politics. And there has been some instances of corruption in the past, but that has mostly been ironed out in recent years, and it is starting to develop more rapidly than it has done before. If we think about its social indicators or factors then, in the 1980s, HIV/AIDS spread, and that went up. The death rate also went up as well, which meant that life expectancy went down. So when these particularly tropical nations and nations near the equator have these problems, it might be AIDS, HIV, but it might also be other types of illnesses, life expectancy does fall, obviously, and that's why it's only 52 in Zambia, although that is starting to increase. That is starting to improve. 1.2 million people with HIV have suffered from HIV in Zambia, and there was also severe drought between 1981 and 83, and that meant that food prices globally increased, but also that meant that poverty in terms of hunger and malnutrition went up as well. There were also some improvements and achievements on the Millennium Development Goals, which we'll talk about in a few minutes' time and show you how those improvements have progressed. And finally, if people did have enough money and do have enough wealth in Zambia, there are good resources in terms of shops and schools, but remember, you have to be able to afford them. You have to be able to pay for them. In terms of its physical factors then, it has, I think it's 28 national parks in total. Some of them are very small, but there are a couple of notable large ones. It does have notable natural resources, so it does have quite an abundance of natural resources, including copper. Over 50% of the land, all of the land total in Zambia, is for farming. A lot of that is subsistence farming, but some of it is developing into commercial farming as well to be sold on for profit. There is no sea border, as we mentioned earlier, and it is a tropical climate, so it does make some farming difficult at certain points of the year, and that is what in the 1980s caused droughts, which in turn caused more starvation and poverty as a result. So the physical factors, the landscape and the climate and so forth that we looked at earlier, do play a massive role in Zambia's ability to develop here. Finally then, in terms of Zambia's economy overall, we've touched on some of this already. 64% of all of its exports are copper. There are also other things they export like flowers and cotton and tobacco. Since 2000, there has really been an increase in Zambia's level of development. So it's really in the last 20 years, we've seen Zambia start to really develop and become more of a high-income LIDC nation. And that's not to say it's highly developed, it's just to say that it is growing in size in terms of its economy. It does have good access to other markets as well, and it works particularly well with China in terms of copper. And there has been a growth in tourism and farming and the use of hydroelectric power through the Kariba Dam, which we'll look at later on as well. So the economy has been able to diversify away from just exporting copper to kind of developing the other aspects of its economy. Mr. Unite, anything you would add there?
No, good. Went through that in loads of detail. Really good points as we go through. We'll find out a little bit more about. So top job there, sir. So what we're going to look now is building on it. We did touch upon, the idea of moving into takeoff. So if we look at this in more detail, there's our 5 stages of the Rostow model, which we talked through on the previous GeogPod. So the key thing for this is, I remember with my Year 11s, when we went through, first couple of lessons, they were, stage 2 country, stage 2 country. But then as we started to delve in more in the role of TNC started coming, they started to find out about copper and those sort of things. They go, actually it's starting to become a stage 3 country into that takeoff. But what they were really clever about is they said, but it's not quite there yet. It's very much only at that start of stage 3. It started to show some of that potential to move on. And the key thing for that is because of those transnational corporations, that although there are disadvantages, things like leakage that we talked about before, that investment they bring with them, the job creation, the investment in infrastructure, is allowing some improvements to technology, to transport, to quality of life, which is allowing to move them forward. And as a result of that, and it becomes more open, things like tourism become more important. The building of the Kariba Dam allows hydroelectric power to develop, and therefore they're moving away from that overall reliance on copper. And so a lot of my group talked about how it was like, they've got all the eggs in one basket, is a saying you might have heard from before. But they're starting to diversify. Although copper still plays a significant part, they are starting to find other sources of income, and therefore moving into that stage 3 takeoff. So in regards to the Millennium Development Goals as well, obviously economic is one side of our development. We want to be thinking about the social side, and within our Millennium Goals, there's obviously a clear focus on social improvements, things like mortality rate, disease, quality of education. And the key thing for this one here in the Millennium Development Goals is there are obviously 8. And Zambia's done an okay job. Okay, it's done about half of them that it's improved, and half of them are not quite improving at the rate that it could be. So for that higher end LIDC, as Mr. Hatchell mentioned, probably about right. If they sold everything, they'd probably be skyrocketing off, wouldn't they? But the key things for areas that they've improved on are in primary education, gender equality, disease, and global partnership. Whereas those that they are not doing quite as well on is dealing with the extreme forms of poverty, child mortality. So again, we talked about infant mortality earlier, those that die under the age of, was it 5, sir? I said earlier, didn't it? Or was it 1? It's 1.
It's 1, yeah.
Yeah, good. For some reason, I was thinking 5 for a second. I was like, no, I think it's because it's picture 5 there. So we've got 1 there. And then in terms of that environmental sustainability, well, the key thing here is if they just suddenly built something like a Kariba Dam, or they're developing things like deforestation and protection of, habitat, is probably not going to be a priority. It's all about that economic growth. So that probably goes some way to explaining why or how they've not necessarily moved forward with regards to those Millennium Development Goals. But if you want a bit more information on that, in the lesson that we did and in the yellow textbook, there's some really good information about the actual stats and facts about the progress on those Millennium Development Goals. So we keep touching upon the role of TNCs here. So what else can you tell me about those in Zambia?
Yeah, so remember, a TNC is a transnational company. So that denotes that it operates over more than 2 places. And the one we looked at, particularly for Zambia, was Associated British Foods, or ABF. And obviously, the term British is in there, so it's a British TNC. And they're now operating in Zambia at a primary, secondary, and tertiary level. So they provide primary, secondary, and tertiary jobs, which is really good for Zambia's economy in the sense that it helps upskill people, it helps educate them and train them to be able to produce more food, to be able to then also grow their economy via higher incomes and so forth. So some of the benefits of that TNC then being in Zambia is that it does invest in infrastructure and is increasing tourism. So more infrastructure, roads, railways, airports, ports, and so forth, denotes that more people will be aware of Zambia, and it already has fantastic wildlife. And so if more people are aware of Zambia and the infrastructure is better to get there and get around Zambia, tourism will also increase. So it has some benefits there. Also, as I mentioned before, it increases the employment opportunities. So they provide employment at a primary, secondary, and tertiary level, which means there's lots of jobs for lots of different types of work. That's a good thing. And it also means that people start to receive a bit of a fair wage for the work that they do. So they're really, really positive aspects of an investment of a TNC like Associated British Foods in Zambia. However, the problem with TNCs moving into these poorer nations is that they can also set rules up so that they don't have to follow law. And if a country is an LITC, generally it doesn't have very strict employment law. So in the UK, we have a minimum wage, for example. And that minimum wage says that no company can legally pay under that amount each hour or each week or whatever it is. Whereas actually in these poorer nations like in Zambia, those laws are not as strict and they might not even exist in some countries. So one of the problems then with TNCs operating in a country like Zambia is they can pay the lowest of salaries, and working conditions and worker rights are quite weak. And so then worker rights and working conditions are quite poor. And there is no difference here with Associated British Foods operating in Zambia. That does happen. And as a result there, TNCs take advantage. They take advantage of the less strict regulations in place. A company like Associated British Foods would not get away with that in the UK. They would be found. There would be audits that take place by government and different trade unions, etc., who are supposed to protect workers. Whereas in Zambia, this doesn't particularly happen, and therefore the TNC can kind of take advantage of that aspect. The next thing then to look at is aid and debt relief, and we kind of touched upon this earlier, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it's just to remember that aid, obviously, and debt relief are designed to help countries out of perilous situations like hazards, but also in the long term to help them develop and invest in infrastructure. So if we think about the idea of water aid and room to read, okay, so they were ways in which Zambia tried to improve its economic development both at the local level and the national level. So those charities were aimed at essentially trying to, with room to read, improve girls' education, and with water aid, improve access to water in certain communities of Zambia. Water aid obviously works as a sustainable approach in villages to try and promote healthier lifestyles, to try and promote clean water, and to try and help people have access to clean water pumped. And wealthier countries also encouraged the decline of the country's massive debt by trying to reduce the amount of debt that countries like Zambia have. And so there was $6.2 billion worth of debt wiped off of Zambia's total debt, which helped, therefore, the country to invest more and use that money in investing in its infrastructure and other types of ways in which they can grow the economy. So essentially, less debt means that we overall have a situation where we can improve the amount of investment there is in the economy and therefore overall improve people's quality of life as well in that nation. Anything to add, Mr. Unite?
No, really good. Nice.
Excellent. So we're on to the last section then for Zambia, and it's looking at two different development strategies. Mr. Unite, would you like to take the first one?
Yeah, go on, let's split it. Yeah, so in bottom up, okay, the one thing I would say is we've also looked at the room to read scheme. So in your case study booklet and other notes, room to read is a really, really good one. But the reason why we've got water aid in this one is obviously it did appear on the previous box as well. So there's two things you can really investigate, but room to read is definitely one to have a look at. The key thing for bottom up, as we said earlier, is all about involving local people in decisions. So if we look at what water aid did, well, it helped the locals to create sanitation and water systems. I'm sure you will remember pictures of like the hand pumps and stuff like that within the villages that were then able to be built, and obviously toilets and sort of central toilet blocks for people to share is really, really significant. You know, there's obviously social benefits to that, in particular around young girls in schooling and making sure they remain in school with the privacy of toilets. But obviously the key benefit is about improving that access to water. And therefore, as you can see, that helped 54,000 people to have access to safe water and 42,000 people with safe sanitation a year. In terms of some negatives, though, okay, obviously if it's a bottom up, we're thinking about a very localized area. We think about a particular village or a small, area within a district or equivalent of a county in the UK. At best, it's all very small scale. We might therefore find that, as well as it depending on volunteers, that we might have across the country numerous different organisations all trying to do the similar sort of thing, but not necessarily being connected up. And all of those, as we know, with regards to NGOs and charities, is they rely on donations. So not only are they dependent on volunteers, but they're depending on people to donate that money. And if that money dries up through, we think about, COVID at this current time, it might stop the amount of people that they're willing to donate. So it's not necessarily guaranteed that that can be a long-term and sustainable future in terms of keeping it going. But obviously there is that real big side that it involves and actually goes to those local people, but it is not on a large scale, whereas things like the Kariba Dam, as Mr. Hatcher's going to go through, can have that whole country impact. So, sir, I've teed you up there. Your turn.
Thank you very much. So, top-down strategy, to remember, is a national large-scale strategy, okay? So it's something that the government and other international organizations might be involved in to almost impose on the country for the benefit of the national economy. Now, the Kariba Dam had investment from China and some other nations, and the idea behind it was to create a renewable, reliable source of energy, as well as to control the amount of water flowing through the river. Now, essentially, with the Kariba Dam in the 1950s, it was built to produce that reliable source of HEP, or hydroelectric power, and new industries as a result of the dam being there developed, such as fishing and tourism. Obviously, tourism because people like to visit these big dam reservoirs behind them because they're interesting to look at, but also fishing because it did create the conditions upstream for fishing to take place. So that's all really good, and it creates new industries where wealth can be created as well. However, there are always negative aspects or disadvantages to top-down strategies like this, and very similar with bottom-up. And the biggest negative aspect of this really was that 57,000 people who lived along where the dam was built had to be essentially displaced or evicted away from the HEP dam area to less fertile areas. So the farming in the areas that they moved to was not as good. The soil wasn't as fertile or rich in nutrients. And that led to 57,000 people, if you like, having individual negative impacts of the dam being built. And also remember, whenever we build a dam on a river, it's really important to remember that the ecosystem of the river is impacted greatly, okay? So the habitats of the fish, the migration patterns of the fish was impacted quite severely. And also the ecosystem generally surrounding it, if you think about tropical rainforest, will have also been impacted from its natural processes. There is also the idea here that with China and its investment, they kind of, and also some American companies as well, kind of essentially said that they wanted the benefits of the renewable electricity to go to them. So wealth created by the renewable electricity was taken away from Zambia, and it wasn't really provided to locals. So that's one of the impacts of a top-down strategy, really, in the sense that it doesn't, whilst it benefits the national economy, local people sometimes don't win from those impacts positively either. So that is the bottom-up and top-down strategies of Zambia's development projects, and that is the entire Zambia case study summarized nicely. Of course, you can go to your case study booklet, which you should have, and to the GeogPod on case studies alone. I go through this in a bit more detail for you, but we just wanted to give you a kind of roundup of everything that you looked at within your lessons. Mr. Unite, any words of wisdom to add before we leave?
No, definitely think this is a really nice topic to get your teeth into. Loads of little links between them, and back to UK 21st. But some really key points with regards to case studies. But I think it's a really interesting unit. So hopefully one that we can go away and get some quality revision done.
Absolutely right. Well done, Year 11. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully you found this useful. Please do give us feedback if you feel the need to. If you have any questions about this topic, please do ask your teacher. We're more than happy to help you. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. See you later.